They say a mother's love knows no boundaries. But what happens when that love becomes the very weapon that destroys everything you hold sacred? My name is Linda Richards, and at 74 years old, I thought I had seen every shade of heartbreak this world could offer. I buried my husband of 48 years just 18 months ago. I've watched my health decline, my independence slip away bit by bit, and my golden years turn into something I never imagined they would become. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the morning I discovered that my own children had stolen the one thing that connected me to the love of my life. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just a story about theft. It's not even just a story about addiction, though that demon plays a starring role in this tragedy. This is a story about the moment when unconditional love meets immovable boundaries, and what happens when a mother realizes that sometimes saving your children means destroying everything they think they know about you. What I'm about to share with you will shake you to your core, because it forced me to make a choice that no parent should ever have to make. I had to choose between being the mother who enables and the mother who saves. I had to choose between their comfort and their future, and in the end, I had to choose between the woman I had always been and the woman I needed to become. The morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains the way it had every day for the past 43 years in this house, casting the same golden rectangles across the hardwood floor that Harold had installed with his own hands back in 1981. I remember how proud he was of those floors, how he'd gotten down on his knees despite his bad back to make sure each plank was perfectly aligned. That's the kind of man he was. Everything had to be done right, with care, with intention. I suppose that's why the small jewelry box on my dresser meant so much to me. Harold had given it to me on our 25th wedding anniversary, a simple wooden box with a velvet interior that he'd crafted in his workshop during those long winter evenings when arthritis kept him from the heavier projects he loved. Inside that box, I kept the most precious remnants of our life together. My engagement ring, the one he'd saved for 8 months to buy when we were just kids with more dreams than dollars. A pair of pearl earrings he'd surprised me with when I graduated nursing school, and most importantly, his wedding ring. Harold had always been a big man, hands like baseball mitts from decades of construction work. And even in his final days when cancer had whittled away at everything else, those hands remained strong and familiar. When the hospice nurse had gently removed his wedding ring after he passed, she'd placed it carefully in my palm and closed my fingers around it. That ring had lived on his finger for 48 years, and now it lived in my jewelry box, the last physical piece of him that I could hold whenever the loneliness became too heavy to bear. I had developed a routine in the months since Harold's passing. Every morning, I would sit at my dresser, open that little wooden box, and touch his ring. Not to put it on. That would have felt wrong somehow, but just to feel the smooth gold against my fingertips and remember what it felt like when he would take my hand in his. It was my daily communion with the love we'd shared, my private moment of connection before facing another day in a world that felt increasingly foreign without him. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other. I had slept poorly again, waking up every few hours reaching for a body that was no longer there, and by 6 o'clock I had given up on rest altogether. The house was quiet in that particular way that only a house full of memories can be, where every creak of the floorboards seems to whisper stories of all the life that has happened within these walls. I made my coffee in the kitchen where Harold and I had shared thousands of breakfasts, where we'd helped our children with homework, where we'd planned birthdays and holidays and anniversaries. The familiar ritual was comforting in its predictability. 2 teaspoons of sugar, just a splash, of cream stirred clockwise exactly 12 times. Harold used to tease me about counting, but routines had always been my anchor in a world that seemed determined to shift beneath my feet. With my coffee in hand, I made my way back to the bedroom and settled into the chair at my dresser. The morning light was perfect, illuminating the carved details of Harold's little jewelry box and making the few pieces inside sparkle with quiet dignity. I reached for the small brass clasp, lifted the lid, and felt my entire world tilt off its axis. The ring was gone. For a moment, my mind simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The little velvet slot where Harold's ring had rested for 18 months was empty, leaving only a small indentation in the fabric where it had been. I stared at that empty space, willing the ring to materialize, convinced that I was still dreaming, or that my aging eyes were playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I blinked, how many times I picked up the box and examined it from different angles, the truth remained unchanged. Someone had taken Harold's ring. My hands began to shake as I searched through the other compartments of the box, hoping against hope that maybe I had moved it, that in my grief-addled state I had placed it somewhere else for safekeeping. But everything else was exactly where it should be. My engagement ring caught the morning light from its usual spot. The pearl earrings lay nestled in their small compartment. Even the cheap bracelet that my daughter Sarah had made for me in 3rd grade was exactly where I had left it. Only Harold's ring was missing. I set the jewelry box down with trembling hands and tried to think rationally. When had I last seen it? Just yesterday morning, I was certain of that. I had my usual moment with it before getting dressed to go to the grocery store. Had I left the box open? No, I was careful about that, always had been. Had I forgotten to lock the front door? That seemed unlikely, but at my age, I supposed anything was possible. The next hour passed in a blur of increasingly frantic searching. I tore apart my bedroom, checking every drawer, every surface, every possible place where I might have absent-mindedly placed the ring. I searched the bathroom, thinking perhaps I had taken it there for some reason I couldn't remember. I combed through the kitchen, the living room, even Harold's old workshop in the basement where dust motes danced in the weak autumn sunlight streaming through cobweb-covered windows. Nothing. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at that empty jewelry box and trying to make sense of something that seemed senseless. Who would take Harold's ring? More importantly, who even knew it was there? The house had been locked. I was certain of that. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There were no signs of a break-in, no other items missing. This wasn't a random burglary. This was personal. And that's when the terrible possibility began to creep into my consciousness like a shadow spreading across water. My children, Marcus and Sarah, had keys to the house, of course. They were my emergency contacts, the ones who were supposed to check on me, help me with things I could no longer manage on my own. In the past year, they had both been coming around more frequently, always with some crisis or another, always needing something. Money, usually. A place to stay for a few days. Help with utilities or rent or car repairs. The requests had become more frequent since Harold's passing, and I had begun to notice a desperate quality to their visits that hadn't been there before. Marcus, my firstborn, had always been a sensitive boy, the kind of child who felt everything. Too deeply. He'd struggled with anxiety as a teenager, and somewhere in his 20s, he'd discovered that pills could quiet the noise in his head. What started as prescription medication for legitimate panic attacks had morphed over the years into something darker, more consuming. He was 45 now, but when he looked at me with those hollow eyes, I still saw that frightened little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Sarah had followed a different path to the same destination. My daughter had always been the social one, the life of every party, the one who could make anyone laugh with her quick wit and infectious energy. But somewhere along the way, the parties had gotten darker, the laughter more forced, and the energy had started coming from bottles and powders instead of genuine joy. She was 42, divorced twice, and seemed to be living from crisis to crisis with no stable ground beneath her feet. I had been watching both of my children spiral for years, offering help where I could, making excuses for behavior that had no excuse, enabling them in ways I was only beginning to understand. Harold had been more skeptical, more willing to set boundaries, but I had always been the soft touch, the one who believed that love could heal anything, that family should never give up on family. But sitting there that morning, staring at the empty space where my husband's ring should have been, I felt something inside me shift. This wasn't just about money or help with bills. This was about the most sacred thing I had left, the physical connection to 48 years of marriage, to a love that had defined who I was as a person. And someone had violated that sanctity for what? Drug money? The thought made my stomach turn. I tried to push the suspicion away, to find other explanations, but the evidence was mounting in ways I couldn't ignore. Marcus had been here just 3 days ago, asking for money to pay his rent. He'd seemed more agitated than usual, sweating, despite the cool October weather, unable to sit still or make eye contact. When I told him I couldn't help him again so soon after the last time, he'd gotten angry, said things about how I was sitting on all this money and property while he was struggling to survive. Sarah had been here even more recently, just yesterday afternoon while I was at the grocery store. She'd used her key to let herself in, claiming she wanted to surprise me by cleaning the house. When I'd returned with my groceries, she'd been coming down from upstairs, explaining that she'd been changing the sheets on my bed as a favor. At the time, I'd been touched by the gesture, but now I wondered what she'd really been doing up there. The realization hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with the pain of it. One of my children, maybe both of them, had stolen the most precious thing I had left. They had come into my home, into my bedroom, into my private space, and taken the one piece of Harold that I could still hold in my hands. I sat there for a long time, letting the grief wash over me in waves. This wasn't just about a ring, though that ring meant everything to me. This was about trust, about family, about the fundamental understanding that some things are sacred and untouchable. This was about realizing that addiction had taken my children so completely that they were no longer the people I had raised, that the demons they carried were stronger than the love we shared. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring, something I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. It was a cold, clear anger, the kind that doesn't burn hot and fast but settles deep in your bones and changes the very chemistry of who you are. For so long, I had been the understanding mother, the enabler, the one who cleaned up messes and made excuses and pretended that everything would be okay if I just loved hard enough. But this was different. This was a line that couldn't be uncrossed, a violation that couldn't be explained away or forgiven with a simple apology. They had taken Harold from me all over again. And for what? For a few dollars, a few pills, a few moments of chemically induced peace that would fade as quickly as it came. I picked up my phone with hands that were no longer shaking, no longer uncertain. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Marcus's number, and then I did something I had never done before in all my years of motherhood. I didn't call to offer help or comfort or understanding. I called to demand answers. The phone rang 4 times before his groggy voice answered. It was almost 9 in the morning, but Marcus often slept until noon these days, another side effect of whatever chemicals were running through his system. "Mom, what's wrong? It's early." "Harold's ring is missing," I said without preamble, my voice steadier than I felt. "It was taken from my jewelry box sometime in the last day or 2. There was a long pause, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had changed, become defensive and artificially confused. "What are you talking about? Why would you think I know anything about that?" "Because you have a key to my house, Marcus. Because you were here 3 days ago. Because you're desperate for money, and you think I don't understand what that desperation makes people do. Mom, I can't believe you're accusing me of stealing from you. That's really hurtful. I would never take anything from you. especially not Dad's ring. You know how much that meant to all of us. But I could hear it in his voice, the slight tremor that had always given him away when he was lying, even as a child. Marcus had never been a good liar, which was probably why his addiction had been so hard for him to hide. He wore his deceptions, like clothes that didn't fit right, always tugging at them, always uncomfortable in their ill-fitting embrace. "I need you to come over here," I said. "Both you and Sarah. We need to talk about this face to face." "Mom, I told you, I don't know anything about—" "1 hour," I interrupted. "Both of you. If you don't show up, I'm calling the police." I hung up before he could respond, before he could offer more excuses or explanations that would only insult both our intelligence. Then I called Sarah, had almost the same conversation, heard the same defensive denials and forced confusion. But I also heard the same telltale signs of deception, the same uncomfortable silences and overcompensated emotion. While I waited for them to arrive, I sat in Harold's old recliner and tried to prepare myself for what was coming. In 1 hour, I was going to confront my children about stealing from me. In 1 hour, I was going to have to look them in the eyes and acknowledge that they had become strangers to me, that the addiction that had been eating away at them for years had finally consumed whatever was left of the people I had raised. But more than that, I was going to have to decide what came next. For so long, I had been content to be the victim of their choices, to absorb their chaos and clean up their messes and pretend that my love could somehow fix what was broken inside them. But Harold's ring had changed something fundamental in me. It had shown me that there were lines that couldn't be crossed, boundaries that had to be defended, consequences that had to be faced. As I sat there in the morning light, surrounded by 43 years of memories in a house that had once been filled with laughter and love and hope, I realized that I was about to do something I had never done before. I was about to choose myself over my children. I was about to choose Harold's memory over their immediate needs. I was about to choose justice over enabling, consequences over comfort. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something that had been missing from my life since Harold's passing. I felt powerful. I felt like I had agency in my own story, like I was the author of my own life rather than just a character in theirs. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 10 o'clock, and I waited for my children to arrive, knowing that when they walked through that door, they would be walking into a conversation that would change everything between us. They would be walking into the presence of a woman they had never met before, a woman who had finally found her spine after 7 decades of bending to accommodate everyone else's needs. They had taken my husband's ring, but in doing so, they had given me something I hadn't realized I'd lost along the way. They had given me back myself. They arrived within minutes of each other, which told me everything I needed to know. Marcus pulled into my driveway first in that beat-up Honda he'd been driving for the past 3 years, the one with the dent in the passenger door and the muffler that announced his presence 2 blocks away. Sarah followed in her newer car, a sedan she'd somehow managed to keep despite her financial struggles, though I'd learned not to ask too many questions about how she maintained things that should have been beyond her means. I watched them through the living room window as they met on the front walkway, their body language telling a story I'd seen countless times before. Marcus ran his hands through his thinning hair, a nervous habit he'd developed as a teenager. Sarah crossed her arms and looked back toward the street as if she might bolt at any moment. They exchanged words I couldn't hear, but I could see the tension in their shoulders, the way they both kept glancing toward the house where they knew I was waiting. When they finally knocked, I took my time answering. I wanted them to stand, there for a moment, to feel the weight of what was coming. When I opened the door, I saw my children as if for the first time in years, really saw them without the filter of maternal love that had been obscuring the truth. Marcus looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow in a way that spoke of poor nutrition and chemical dependency. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been strong and broad like his father's, and his eyes darted everywhere except to mine. The son who had once been the star of his high school baseball team, who had married his college sweetheart and dreamed of becoming a teacher, stood before me looking like a stranger wearing my child's face. Sarah had managed to maintain more of an appearance of normalcy, but I could see the cracks if I looked closely enough. Her makeup was applied with the careful precision of someone trying to hide something, and her smile was too bright, too forced. She hugged me when she came in, but it felt performative, like she was acting out the role of loving daughter rather than actually being one. They both settled into the living room with an uncomfortable casualness, Sarah on the couch where she'd spent countless hours as a teenager talking on the phone with friends, Marcus in the chair where Harold used to read his evening paper. The familiarity of their positions in this room that had witnessed so much of our family's history made what was about to happen feel even more surreal. For a few moments, we sat in silence. I could see them both preparing their stories, arranging their faces into expressions of concern and confusion. They were getting ready to lie to me, and they expected me to participate in the fiction the way I always had before. They expected me to be the mother who wanted to believe them more than she wanted to know the truth. But that mother was gone. She had died somewhere between discovering the empty jewelry box and making those phone calls. The woman sitting across from them now was someone different, someone harder, someone who had finally learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just enabling dressed up in prettier clothes. Sarah spoke first, her voice carrying that artificially bright tone she used when she was trying to deflect serious conversations. "Mom, Marcus told me about the ring. I'm so sorry something happened to it. Have you checked everywhere? You know how easy it is to misplace things, especially when you're dealing with grief." The condescension in her voice hit me like a slap. She was talking to me the way you'd talk to a confused elderly person, someone whose faculties couldn't be trusted, someone whose concerns could be dismissed with patronizing reassurance. For a moment I felt a flash of doubt. Was I losing my mind? Was this all just the paranoid delusions of an old woman living alone with her memories? But then I looked at Marcus, saw the way he was gripping the arms of Harold's chair, his knuckles white with tension, and I knew. I had raised these children. I had watched them grow from babies into adults. I knew their tells, their habits, their ways of moving through the world when they were comfortable and when they were afraid. And right now, they were both terrified. "I haven't misplaced anything," I said quietly. "The ring was in my jewelry box yesterday morning. It's gone today. Nothing else is missing. Someone with a key to this house took it." Marcus finally looked at me then, and I saw desperation in his eyes that made my heart break even as it confirmed my worst fears. "Mom, you can't seriously think that we would steal from you. We're your children. We loved Dad too. That ring meant something to all of us." "Did it?" I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like it meant exactly enough to sell for whatever drugs you needed to get through another day. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Sarah's carefully constructed smile faltered, and Marcus looked like I'd physically struck him. But neither of them denied it. Neither of them jumped up in righteous indignation to defend their honor. They both just sat there, caught in the terrible truth of what they'd become. "I know about the addiction," I continued, my voice steady, despite the tremor I felt in my chest. "I've known for years. I've watched you both spiral, and I've made excuse after excuse, given you money when I knew where it was going, cleaned up your messes, lied to friends and family about why you missed holidays or birthdays or important events. I've been complicit in your destruction because I thought that's what love looked like." Sarah's composure cracked first. Tears began to stream down her face, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. "Mom, you don't understand. It's not that simple. We never wanted to hurt you. We never wanted things to get this bad." "But they did get this bad," I said. "They got so bad that you came into my bedroom, into my private space, and took the one thing I had left of your father. Do you understand what that ring meant to me? It wasn't just jewelry. It was 48 years of marriage. It was the last piece of him I could hold in my hands. Marcus was crying now too, silent tears that rolled down his cheeks as he stared at the floor. We were desperate, Mom. I haven't been able to work in months. Sarah's been helping me, trying to keep me from getting evicted, but we're both barely hanging on. When we saw the ring just sitting there, we thought you wouldn't notice right away. We thought we could pawn it and then buy it back before you knew it was gone. The honesty was somehow worse than the lies would have been. They had planned this. They had looked at my most precious possession and seen it as a solution to their temporary problems, never considering that some things are irreplaceable, that some violations can't be undone with good intentions and future plans. Where is it now? I asked. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. We pawned it yesterday afternoon, at that place on Riverside Drive. But Mom, we can get it back. We have 30 days, and we'll find the money somewhere. We'll make this right. How? I asked. How will you make this right? You've been promising to make things right for years, and every time, you just dig the hole deeper. Every time I help you, I'm just enabling you to hurt yourselves and everyone around you more. Marcus looked up at me then, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the little boy he used to be, the one who would run to me with scraped knees and trust that I could fix anything. Please don't give up on us, Mom. We know we've messed up, but we're still your kids. We still love you. Are you? I asked. Are you still my kids? Because the children I raised would never have done this. The children I raised understood that some things are sacred, that family doesn't steal from family, that love means protecting the people you care about, not exploiting their vulnerability. The silence that followed was deafening. We all sat, there in the living room, where we'd celebrated so many Christmas mornings, where we'd watched movies and played board games and shared the ordinary moments that make up a family's life. But those people were gone now, replaced by strangers who looked like my children, but had lost whatever essential quality had made them mine. Sarah tried one more time to reach me, to find the soft-hearted mother who had always been their safety net. Mom, addiction is a disease. We're sick, not evil. We need help, not punishment. I've been trying to help you for years, I said. I've given you money, opened my home to you, made excuses for you, enabled your choices at every turn. And what has it gotten any of us? You're sicker now than you've ever been, and I've lost the husband I adored, and now the last piece of him I had left. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back like something wild caught in a cage. So, what are you saying? That you're done with us? That we're not your children anymore? I'm saying that I'm done being the person who makes it possible for you to keep destroying yourselves. I'm done being the safety net that keeps you from hitting bottom. I'm done pretending that my love can fix what you've broken inside yourselves. You can't just stop loving us, Sarah said, her voice rising with panic. We're your children. That's not how family works. I'll never stop loving you, I said, and I meant it. But I'm done confusing love with enabling. I'm done thinking that helping you avoid consequences is the same as helping you heal. I'm done sacrificing my own dignity and peace of mind on the altar of your addiction. Marcus spun around to face me, his eyes wild with desperation and something that might have been anger. What does that mean? What are you going to do? I stood up then, feeling every one of my 74 years in my bones, but also feeling something I hadn't felt in decades, a sense of my own power, my own agency in the story of my life. I'm going to stop being your victim. I'm going to stop letting your choices define my existence. And I'm going to stop pretending that what you did to me is acceptable just because you're sick. Mom, please, Sarah begged, standing to face me. We'll get help. We'll go to rehab. We'll pay you back for the ring. Just don't give up on us. You've said that before, I said quietly. Many times, and each time I believed you because I wanted to believe you. But believing you has become its own form of insanity, and I can't afford to be insane anymore. The look that passed between my children then was one I recognized from their teenage years, when they would silently communicate their plans to present a united front against parental authority. They were strategizing, trying to figure out how to manage me, how to get back to the familiar dynamic where they created chaos, and I cleaned it up. But I was no longer the woman who could be managed. Something fundamental had shifted in me when I opened that jewelry box and found it violated. I had spent so many years defining myself through my relationships to other people, as Harold's wife, as Marcus and Sarah's mother, as the woman who held everyone else's life together, that I had forgotten I was also just Linda Richards, a person with her own needs and boundaries and dignity. Marcus came closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me the way he might intimidate someone he was trying to manipulate for drug money. "Mom, you're being dramatic. We made a mistake. But it's not the end of the world. Families get through things like this all the time." "Do they?" I asked. "Do families get through one generation stealing from another? Do they get through children violating their parents' most sacred possessions? Do they get through years of lies and manipulation and broken promises? Because if they do, I haven't seen evidence of it." Sarah tried a different approach, moving to sit beside me on the couch and taking my hand in hers. Her touch was cold, and I could feel the slight tremor that ran through her fingers. "Mom, you're scaring us. This isn't like you. You've always been understanding, always been willing to forgive. That's who you are." "Maybe that's who I was," I said, gently removing my hand from hers. "But that woman got her most precious possession stolen by her own children. That woman got taken advantage of one too many times. That woman finally realized that being understanding and forgiving doesn't actually help anyone when there are never any consequences for terrible behavior." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. This time I could see the realization dawning in their eyes that they were not going to be able to manipulate their way out of this situation. They were not going to be able to cry or plead or promise their way back to the comfortable dynamic we'd had before, where they could take what they needed from me, and I would absorb the damage without complaint. Marcus sat back down heavily, and for the first time since they'd arrived, he looked directly at me with something approaching honesty. "What do you want from us, Mom? What can we do to fix this?" "I want you to understand that actions have consequences," I said. "I want you to understand that stealing from your mother isn't something that can be fixed with apologies and promises. I want you to understand that I am not an inexhaustible resource that exists solely for your benefit." "But we're your children," Sarah said again, as if that phrase was a magic spell that could reset everything back to the way it had been. "Yes," I said. "You are my children, and because you are my children, because I love you more than my own life, I'm going to do something I should have done years ago. I'm going to let you experience the full weight of your choices without cushioning the blow." Marcus's face went pale. "What does that mean?" "It means that when you get evicted because you spent your rent money on drugs, I'm not going to let you move back in here. It means that when you get arrested for whatever you're doing to get money for your addiction, I'm not going to bail you out. It means that when you're hungry and desperate and scared, I'm not going to rescue you just because you call me crying." Sarah stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "That's cruel, Mom. That's not love. That's punishment. That's revenge." "No," I said calmly. "Revenge would be trying to hurt you the way you've hurt me. What I'm talking about is consequences. What I'm talking about is stepping back and letting you learn from your choices instead of protecting you from them." "You can't just abandon us," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "We're all you have left." "Am I all you have left?" I asked. "Because it doesn't feel that way. It feels like I'm just a resource to be exploited, a problem to be managed, a source of money and shelter and forgiveness that you can access whenever your other options run out." The truth of that statement hung in the air between us, and I could see from their faces that they recognized it even if they didn't want to admit it. How long had it been since either of them had visited me just to spend time with me? How long since they'd called to ask how I was doing instead of what I could do for them? How long since they'd treated me like a person instead of like a solution to their latest crisis? "That's not fair," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I asked. "When was the last time you came to see me when you didn't need something? When was the last time you remembered my birthday or called just to chat? When was the last time you treated me like your mother instead of like your personal bank and crisis management service?" Neither of them could answer that question, and their silence was answer enough. Marcus tried one more approach, his voice taking on the wheedling tone I'd heard so many times before. "Mom, we know we've been selfish. We know we've taken advantage of your kindness. But we can change. We want to change. We just need one more chance." "How many more chances?" I asked. "How many times have I heard that exact speech? How many times have you promised to change, sworn things would be different, convinced me to trust you just one more time? And where has it gotten us? You're both sicker than ever. And I've lost the most important thing I had left in this world." The conversation was beginning to feel circular, with them making the same desperate pleas and me responding with the same hard truths. But I could see something shifting in their demeanor, a growing realization that they were not going to be able to charm or manipulate their way out of this situation. They were going to have to face the fact that their choices had consequences, that their mother was not an infinite well of forgiveness and resources. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked quietly. "Now you leave," I said. "You go back to your lives, and you figure out how to live them without using me as a safety net. You figure out how to be adults who are responsible for their own choices and their own consequences." "And if we need help?" Marcus asked. "Then you find it somewhere else," I said. "There are programs, there are resources, there are people who are trained to help with addiction. But I'm not one of them. I'm just an old woman who has been pretending that love could cure what only you can cure in yourselves." They both stood there for a moment, looking at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. This was not the mother they knew, not the woman who had always been available to clean up their messes and absorb their chaos. This was someone new, someone they had never encountered before. "We should go," Marcus said finally. "Yes," I agreed. "You should." As they moved toward the door, Sarah turned back one more time. "Mom, we really do love you, and we really are sorry about the ring." "I know," I said, "but sorry doesn't bring it back. Sorry doesn't undo the violation. Sorry doesn't change the fact that when you needed money, you thought of me not as your mother who was still grieving her husband, but as someone whose possessions could be turned into cash." She nodded, tears streaming down her face again, and followed Marcus out the door. I watched from the window as they stood on my front walk for several minutes, talking intensely, probably trying to figure out what had just happened and how they could fix it. Finally, they got in their separate cars and drove away, leaving me alone in the house that had once been filled with so much love and laughter. For a long time, I sat in Harold's chair and tried to process what I had just done. I had drawn a line in the sand with the two people I loved most in the world. I had chosen my own dignity and peace of mind over their immediate needs. I had refused to be the mother who enables and chosen instead to be the mother who holds her children accountable for their choices. It felt terrible and liberating at the same time, like setting a broken bone. Painful in the moment, but necessary for proper healing. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living my own life instead of just reacting to theirs. But as the afternoon wore on and the house grew quiet around me, I also felt the weight of what I had lost. Not just Harold's ring, though that absence would always be a wound in my heart. I had also lost the illusion that my children were still the people I had raised, that my love could somehow protect them from the consequences of their choices, that being a mother meant absorbing every blow rather than teaching them to withstand their own. As evening approached, I made myself dinner for one and ate it at the kitchen table where Harold and I had shared so many meals. The silence was different now, not the comfortable quiet of a house at rest, but the profound stillness of a life that had been fundamentally altered. I was truly alone now in a way I had never been before, even in the months since Harold's death. But I was also myself in a way I hadn't been in years. I was Linda Richards, not just someone's wife or mother, but a woman with her own needs and boundaries and dignity. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. The weeks that followed felt like living in a house made of echoes. Every room carried the memory of conversations that would never happen again. At least, not in the same way. I found myself moving through my daily routines with a strange mixture of relief and profound sadness, like someone recovering from major surgery who knows the operation was necessary, but still grieves for what was cut away. 3 days after. Our confrontation, Marcus called. I almost didn't answer when I saw his name on the caller ID, but something compelled me to pick up. His voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of the manipulative edge that had become so familiar over the years. Mom, I just wanted to tell you that we got your ring back. For a moment, my heart leaped with hope and gratitude, but then, he continued, Sarah sold her car to get the money. She's walking to work now, taking buses when the weather's bad. She wanted you to know that getting it back was more important to her than having transportation. I sat down heavily in the kitchen chair where I'd been sorting through mail, trying to process this information. Part of me wanted to rush over to wherever they were and retrieve Harold's ring immediately, to hold it in my hands again and feel that connection to my husband. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since that morning I'd found the empty jewelry box, recognized this gesture for what it was. Where is it? I asked. Sarah has it. She's afraid to bring it to you herself. She thinks you hate her now. I don't hate her, I said quietly. I don't hate either of you. But I also can't pretend that getting the ring back erases what happened. There was a long pause before Marcus spoke again. She sacrificed her car, Mom. She's making her life harder to fix what we did wrong. Doesn't that count for something? I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug of maternal instinct, the desire to praise and reward any gesture toward doing the right thing. This was how it had always worked between us. They would mess up, sometimes catastrophically, and then make some grand gesture of atonement. And I would be so grateful for any sign of remorse that I would forgive everything and reset our relationship back to its previous state. But sitting there in my kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary objects of my ordinary life, I realized that this pattern was exactly what had enabled their downward spiral. By accepting grand gestures in place of real change, by allowing dramatic acts of atonement to substitute for consistent responsible behavior, I had taught them that consequences could always be avoided if they just performed enough regret. It counts, I said finally. But it doesn't fix everything. Getting the ring back doesn't undo the fact that you took it in the first place. It doesn't change the fact that you violated my trust and my grief for your father. It doesn't erase years of lies and manipulation and broken promises. So what do you want from us? Marcus's voice was rising, taking on that familiar edge of frustration when his attempts at emotional manipulation weren't working. Sarah literally gave up her car to make this right. What more can we do? I want you to understand that making things right isn't about one dramatic gesture, I said. It's about changing the patterns that led to this situation in the first place. It's about becoming people who wouldn't steal from their mother, regardless of how desperate they felt. We are trying to change, he said. But even as he spoke, the words, I could hear the hollowness in them. They were words he'd said before, many times, usually when he needed something from me. Are you? I asked. Are you in treatment? Are you going to meetings? Are you working with counselors or therapists or anyone who can help you address the underlying issues that led to this? The silence that followed was answer enough. I'll take the ring back, I said, but only because it belongs to me, not because accepting it means everything goes back to the way it was before. That version of our relationship is over, Marcus. The version where you could hurt me and manipulate me and steal from me and then make a grand gesture to reset everything back to normal. That mother is gone. When Sarah came to return the ring 2 days later, she looked like she'd aged years in the few weeks since our confrontation. Her face was drawn and tired, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who was holding herself together through sheer force of will. She handed me the small velvet pouch without meeting my eyes, and I could see her hands shaking as she let go of it. "Thank you," I said, meaning it. Holding Harold's ring again was like being reunited with a piece of my soul that I'd thought was lost forever. "I'm sorry," she whispered, finally looking up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and full of pain. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know how we got to this point. I don't know how we became people who would hurt you like this." For a moment, looking at my daughter's face, I saw the little girl she'd been, the one who used to bring me dandelions she'd picked from the yard and present them like rare orchids. I saw the teenager who'd cried in my arms when her first boyfriend broke her heart, who'd trusted me with her deepest fears and dreams. I saw the young woman who'd stood at my side during Harold's illness, who'd held my hand at his funeral and promised she'd always be there for me. All of those versions of Sarah were still there, buried under layers of addiction and bad choices and broken promises. But recognizing their existence didn't mean I could ignore the reality of who she had become, or pretend that love alone could excavate the person she used to be. "I know you're sorry," I said. "But sorry isn't enough anymore. Sorry is what you say when you accidentally break a dish or forget someone's birthday. Sorry doesn't cover stealing your dead father's wedding ring to buy drugs." She flinched as if I'd slapped her, and I almost softened my words. Almost. But then I thought about the empty jewelry box, about the violation of trust, about all the times I'd accepted apologies and promises only to have them broken again within weeks or months. "What can I do?" she asked. "Tell me what I can do to earn your forgiveness." "Stop asking for my forgiveness," I said. "Start working on forgiving yourself. Start working on becoming someone who doesn't need forgiveness for the same things over and over again." "I don't understand," she said, looking genuinely confused. "You're focused on managing my reaction to what you did, instead of focusing on changing the patterns that led you to do it in the first place. You want me to forgive you so you can feel better about yourself, so you can go back to the comfortable dynamic where I'm the understanding mother who cleans up your messes. But that's not healing, Sarah. That's just resetting the cycle." I watched her struggle with this concept, saw her trying to process a perspective she'd never encountered before. For all of our lives together, I had been the one who absorbed the consequences of other people's choices, who worked to maintain harmony and comfort, even when that comfort came at the expense of growth and accountability. "I gave up my car," she said, as if this fact could somehow bridge the gap between us. "I know," I said, "and I appreciate that sacrifice. But you gave up your car to get back something you never should have taken in the first place. That's not generosity, Sarah. That's just returning stolen property." The words hung between us like a physical barrier, and I could see her struggling to find some argument that would penetrate my newfound resolve. She was used to being able to appeal to my emotions, to find the soft spots in my defenses and exploit them until I gave her what she needed. But those soft spots had hardened over like scar tissue, and she was discovering that the mother she'd always known was no longer available to her. "You've changed," she said finally, and there was an accusation in her voice, as if my transformation was somehow unfair to her. "Yes," I agreed. "I have changed. Discovering that your children have stolen your most precious possession will do that to a person." "But you're our mother," she said, as if that fact should trump everything else, should make me return to the role she was comfortable with me playing. "I am your mother," I said, "but I'm also a person with my own needs and boundaries. I'm also Harold's widow, still grieving the loss of the only man I ever loved. I'm also Linda Richards, a woman who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity by her own children." She stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, and I realized that in all the years of our relationship, she had never really thought of me as a separate person with my own inner life and needs. I had been so successful at subsuming my identity into my roles as wife and mother that my children had never learned to see me as anything else. "I need help," she said suddenly, desperately. "I can't do this alone. The addiction, the depression, all of it. I need help and I don't know where to get it." For a moment, every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to offer that help, to give her the resources and support she was asking for. This was what I'd been waiting for, wasn't it? An admission that she needed help, a recognition that she couldn't continue on her current path? But then I remembered all the other times she'd asked for help, all the other moments when she'd seemed ready to change, and I remembered what had happened each time I'd rushed in to provide solutions. I had become her external motivation, her safety net, the person who wanted her recovery more than she wanted it herself. And as long as I was willing to do the work of saving her, she would never learn to save herself. "There are resources available," I said carefully. "There are programs and counselors and support groups. There are people who are trained to help with addiction and mental health issues." "But I need money for those things," she said. "I need insurance or cash or someone to help me navigate the system. I don't know how to do this by myself." "Then you'll learn," I said, as gently as I could manage. "You'll figure it out the way millions of other people have figured it out. You'll make it a priority and find a way to make it happen." "You're really not going to help me?" she asked, and I could hear the disbelief in her voice. "I'm not going to do it for you," I corrected. "There's a difference. Helping you would mean supporting you while you do the work. Doing it for you would mean taking responsibility for your recovery so you don't have to." She stood there for a long moment, and I could see her cycling through all the strategies she'd used over the years to get me to give her what she wanted. The tears, the promises, the guilt, the manipulation disguised as love. But none of them were working, and I could see the moment when she realized that this conversation was not going to end the way she'd expected. "I should go," she said finally. "Yes," I agreed. "You should." After she left, I sat with Harold's ring for a long time, sliding it onto my thumb where it fit loosely but securely. Having it back felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd thought was lost forever, but it also felt different somehow. It was the same ring, but I was not the same woman who had lost it. The experience of having it stolen and getting it back had changed something fundamental in my relationship to everything I held dear. The following weeks brought a series of tests to my newfound resolve. Marcus was evicted from his apartment and called asking if he could stay with me just until he got back on his feet. I said no, and suggested he look into homeless shelters or transitional housing programs. Sarah's electricity was shut off and she called crying, asking for money to get it turned back on. I said no, and suggested she contact social services or local charities that helped with utility bills. Each of these conversations was agonizing. Every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to help them, to prevent them from experiencing discomfort or hardship. But I held firm, remembering that my previous attempts to cushion their falls had only enabled them to keep making the same destructive choices. The hardest call came on a Thursday evening in November. Sarah called from a hospital emergency room where she'd been taken after collapsing at work. She was dehydrated and malnourished, and the doctors wanted to keep her for observation. She needed someone to pick her up when she was released, and she had no one else to call. I sat in my kitchen listening to her weak, scared voice asking for help, and for a moment I wavered. This wasn't about money or drugs or manipulation. This was about basic medical care, about my daughter's health and safety. How could I say no to that? But then I remembered something Harold used to say when the children were young and learning to ride bicycles or climb trees or navigate the small challenges of childhood. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let them fall. He would tell me when I wanted to rush in and prevent every scrape and bruise. That's how they learn they can get back up. There are social workers at the hospital, I told Sarah. There are resources available to help people in your situation. You can ask them for assistance with transportation, with finding temporary housing, with connecting to services you need. Mom, please, she begged. I'm scared and I'm alone, and I don't know how to navigate all of this by myself. Then you'll learn, I said, my voice breaking despite my resolve. You'll figure it out because you have to, because no one else is going to do it for you. The silence that followed was filled with so much pain and disappointment that I almost changed my mind. Almost. But then she hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat there in my quiet house, wondering if I was the worst mother in the world, or finally learning how to be the mother my children actually needed. Over the next several days, I heard nothing from either Marcus or Sarah. The silence was deafening, filled with all the conversations we weren't having, all the crises I wasn't managing, all the chaos I wasn't absorbing. For the first time in years, I was living my own life instead of constantly reacting to theirs, and the adjustment was more difficult than I had anticipated. I found myself with time and mental energy I hadn't had in decades. Without the constant drama and crisis management that had defined my relationship with my children, I had space to think about what I actually wanted from the remainder of my life. I started reading again, something I'd given up during Harold's illness and had never resumed. I began taking long walks through the neighborhood, noticing changes in houses and gardens that had happened while I'd been too distracted to pay attention. Most surprisingly, I started making friends. Real friends, not just acquaintances from church or the grocery store. I joined a grief support group at the community center and met other widows who were navigating similar challenges. I discovered that many of them had dealt with adult children who had addiction or mental health issues, and their stories helped me understand that I wasn't alone in the difficult choices I'd been forced to make. One woman, Helen, had cut off contact with her son for 3 years after he'd stolen her late husband's tools to sell for drug money. Another, Margaret, had refused to bail her daughter out of jail after multiple arrests for drug-related charges. These women understood the particular agony of loving someone who was determined to destroy themselves, and they understood the courage it took to step back and let consequences unfold naturally. The hardest thing about addiction, Helen told me one evening after our group meeting, is that it makes you choose between being kind and being helpful. You can't do both. Being kind means cushioning their falls and protecting them from consequences. Being helpful means letting them experience the full weight of their choices so they can learn to make better ones. Her words resonated with something deep inside me, validating choices that had felt cruel and necessary in equal measure. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like maybe I wasn't losing my mind or my heart. Maybe I was finally learning the difference between love and enabling, between supporting someone and carrying them. As November turned into December, the holiday season approached with all its complicated emotions. Christmas had always been the most important celebration in our family, the time when we all came together regardless of whatever conflicts or tensions had built up during the year. Harold and I had hosted Christmas dinner for 37 years, and even after the children became adults with their own problems and complications, they had always found their way home for Christmas. This year would be different. I had no idea if Marcus and Sarah would even acknowledge the holiday, much less want to spend it with me. I had no idea if they were safe or healthy, or getting the help they needed. I had no idea if they hated me for the boundaries I'd set, or if they were slowly beginning to understand why those boundaries had been necessary. The uncertainty was almost unbearable, but it was also strangely liberating. For the first time in decades, I could make Christmas plans based on what I wanted to do, rather than what everyone else needed from me. I could decide how to spend the holiday without worrying about managing other people's emotions or expectations. I started small, decorating my house the way Harold and I used to before the children's lives became so chaotic that everything had to revolve around crisis management. I put up the Christmas tree we'd bought together 40 years ago, hung the ornaments we'd collected during our travels, played the music we'd always loved. The house looked beautiful and felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in years. 2 weeks before Christmas, I received a letter in the mail. My name and address were written in Sarah's careful handwriting, and for a moment my heart raced with anticipation and anxiety. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. Mom, I wanted you to know that I've been in a residential treatment program for the past month. I'm learning a lot about myself and about addiction and about the patterns that led me to hurt you and Dad's memory so badly. I'm not writing to ask for anything or to try to convince you to forgive me. I'm writing because I want you to know that I'm finally working on becoming someone who deserves your love instead of just expecting it. I hope you have a peaceful Christmas. Love, Sarah. I read the letter 3 times, looking for the manipulation or hidden agenda that had colored so many of our previous communications, but there was none. This was simply information, shared without expectation or demand. It was the first honest communication I'd received from either of my children in years, and it gave me hope in a way that all their previous promises and apologies never had. I put the letter on my refrigerator next to the grocery list and the phone numbers for my doctor and the grief support group. It felt like a small miracle, a sign that maybe the boundaries I'd set hadn't destroyed our relationship, but had finally created space for it to become something real and healthy. Christmas morning came quietly, without the usual chaos of gift exchanges and family dynamics and carefully managed expectations. I spent the morning in Harold's chair, drinking coffee and watching the snow fall outside our living room window. At noon, I drove to Helen's house, where several of us from the grief support group had decided to spend the holiday together. We ate a simple meal and shared stories about our spouses and our children, and the complicated nature of love that endures even when relationships change. It wasn't the Christmas I'd imagined having at this stage of my life, but it was peaceful and genuine in a way that the previous few years of forced family gatherings had not been. I went to sleep that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Contentment with my own choices, pride in my own strength, and hope for whatever was coming next. But even as I was learning to build a life based on my own needs and boundaries, I knew that this story was far from over. Somewhere out there, my children were living their own lives, making their own choices, learning their own lessons. And somewhere in the future that I couldn't yet see, we would all have to decide what kind of relationship was possible between us now that the old patterns had been broken and discarded. The woman who had discovered the empty jewelry box felt like a stranger to me now, someone soft and vulnerable who had confused love with enabling for so many years that she'd forgotten the difference. The woman I was becoming felt harder but also stronger, clearer about her own worth, and more willing to defend it. Whether this new version of myself could find her way back to her children without losing herself again remained to be seen. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that I hadn't felt in decades. The daffodils Harold had planted along our front walkway pushed through the last patches of snow. Bright yellow faces turned toward the strengthening sun. I found myself spending more time in the garden, something I'd neglected during the years, when my attention had been consumed by crisis management and damage control. Working in the soil felt therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. There was something profoundly satisfying about planting seeds and tending to their growth, about creating beauty through patience and consistent care rather than dramatic interventions. As I knelt among the flower beds, pulling weeds and preparing the ground for new plantings, I couldn't help but see metaphors everywhere. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do for a garden was to remove the invasive plants that were choking out healthy growth, even if those plants had once been welcome. It was while I was working in the garden on a particularly warm April morning that I saw Marcus walking up my street. I recognized his gait before I could make out his face, that slightly shuffling walk that had become more pronounced over the years as his health deteriorated. My first instinct was to rush inside to avoid whatever confrontation or manipulation might be coming. But then I stopped myself, brushed the dirt from my hands, and stood up to face whatever was approaching. He looked different. Cleaner, somehow. His clothes were pressed, his hair recently cut, and there was something in his posture that suggested he wasn't in the grip of immediate chemical need. When he got close enough for me to see his eyes, I was shocked to find them clear and focused in a way they hadn't been in years. "Hello, Mom," he said, stopping at the edge of my property line as if he understood that he needed permission to come closer. "Marcus," I said, my voice neutral. I had learned not to let hope color my initial reactions to any changes in my children's appearance or behavior. Too many times, I had mistaken temporary improvements for permanent transformation, only to be disappointed when the underlying patterns reasserted themselves. "I know you probably don't want to see me," he said, his hands clasped behind his, back like a child who had been taught to keep them still. "But I wanted to tell you something, and I wanted to do it in person." I waited, not offering encouragement or discouragement, just space for him to say whatever he had come to say. "I've been clean for 4 months," he said. "Not just off the hard stuff, but everything. No pills, no alcohol, nothing. And I wanted you to know that it wasn't because of anything you said or did. It was because I finally hit a bottom that was so low I couldn't pretend I was still a functioning person." I studied his face, looking for the telltale signs of deception that I'd learned to recognize over the years. The shifty eyes, the slight tremor in his voice, the overcompensated emotion. But I didn't see any of those things. What I saw was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had fought a long war and was finally ready to lay down his weapons. "What happened?" I asked. "I got arrested," he said simply, "for breaking into cars in a parking lot, looking for anything I could sell. It was stupid and desperate and exactly the kind of thing I swore I'd never do. But there I was, 45 years old, rummaging through some stranger's glove compartment at 2 a.m. because I needed $20 for my next fix." He paused, looking down at the daffodils that bordered my walkway. The worst part wasn't getting arrested. The worst part was that while I was sitting in that jail cell, all I could think about was how I was going to get high as soon as I got out. Not about how I'd hurt you and Sarah, not about how I'd disappointed Dad before he died, not about how I was throwing my life away, just about getting high. That's when I realized that I wasn't a person anymore. I was just a collection of chemical needs walking around in a human costume. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. This wasn't the Marcus who made excuses and blamed circumstances and promised to change while already planning his next deception. This was someone who had looked honestly at what he'd become and been horrified by what he'd seen. "What did you do?" I asked. I asked for help. Real help, not just detox and discharge. I found a program that takes people like me, people who've lost everything and have nowhere else to go. It's not easy and it's not quick. I've been living in a halfway house, working a minimum wage job, going to meetings every day, talking to counselors who don't let me get away with any of my old tricks. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen since he was a child. Vulnerability without manipulation, pain without self-pity, hope without entitlement. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he continued. "I'm not here to try to convince you to trust me or forgive me or go back to the way things used to be. I'm here because my counselor says that making amends isn't about getting forgiveness. It's about taking responsibility for the harm you've caused and expressing genuine remorse without expecting anything in return." I stood there in my garden, surrounded by the evidence of new growth and renewal, and felt tears starting to gather in my eyes. Not tears of joy, exactly, but tears of recognition. This was the son I remembered, the one who had existed before addiction had hollowed him out and filled the empty spaces with desperation and deception. "I know I can't undo the damage I've done," he said. "I know I can't give you back all the years I stole from you and Dad with my chaos and my lies. I know I can't erase the pain of having your own child steal something that meant everything to you. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what I took from you, and I understand that you were right to protect yourself from me." The sincerity in his voice was devastating in its simplicity. No dramatic flourishes, no attempts to evoke sympathy, no hidden agendas. Just a man acknowledging the harm he had caused and taking full responsibility for it. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Thank you for telling me this." "There's something else," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Something I want to give you." He pulled out a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns that caught the morning light. It was beautiful, clearly handmade with enormous care and attention to detail. "I made this in the workshop at the facility," he said. "It's not much, and I know it can't replace what I took from you. But I wanted you to have something that came from a better part of me. Something that shows you that there's still good in here somewhere." I took the box from his hands, feeling the smooth wood and the careful craftsmanship. It was exactly the right size for Harold's ring, for my engagement ring, for the few precious pieces of jewelry that connected me to the most important relationships of my life. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. "I should go," he said. "I don't want to take up too much of your time or make you feel like you have to respond to this in any particular way. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to become someone worthy of being your son again." I watched him turn to leave. This man who looked like my child, but spoke with the voice of someone who had finally grown up. Something inside me wanted to call him back, to invite him in for coffee, to bridge the gap between us with conversation and shared time. But I had learned to be cautious with my hope, to let actions accumulate over time before I allowed myself to believe in change. "Marcus?" I called as he reached the sidewalk. He turned back, and I could see that he was prepared for whatever I might say, whether it was encouragement or rejection or something in between. "I'm proud of you for asking for help," I said, "and I hope you keep finding the strength to accept it." He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. "Thank you, Mom. That means more to me than you know." After he left, I sat on my front steps holding the wooden box and trying to process what had just happened. For so long, I had imagined this moment, the moment when one of my children would finally acknowledge the harm they had caused and take real responsibility for their actions. But having it actually happen felt surreal, like something I might have dreamed. I opened the box and placed Harold's ring inside, where it nestled perfectly in the velvet-lined interior. The box itself was a work of art, clearly the product of many hours of patient labor. But more than that, it was evidence of sustained effort, of someone learning to create beauty instead of chaos, to give rather than take. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about Marcus constantly, wondering how he was doing, whether he was maintaining his sobriety, whether the changes I had witnessed were real and lasting. But I resisted the urge to reach out to him, to check on his progress or offer support. My therapist, a wise woman named Dr. Elizabeth Chen, whom I'd started seeing after joining the grief support group, had helped me understand that my children's recovery had to belong to them completely. The moment I inserted myself back into the process, I risked recreating the same dynamic that had enabled their addiction for so many years. "Your job now is to heal yourself," Dr. Chen had told me during one of our sessions. "You've spent so many years focused on their problems that you've never dealt with your own trauma from living with addiction. You've never processed your own grief. not just for Harold, but for the children you thought you were raising before addiction took them away. It was difficult work, learning to sit with my own emotions without immediately looking for ways to fix or manage other people's feelings. I had to confront the reality that my enabling behavior hadn't just hurt Marcus and Sarah by preventing them from experiencing consequences. It had also hurt me by teaching me to ignore my own needs, to sacrifice my own well-being on the altar of other people's immediate comfort. In May, I received another letter, this one from Sarah. She had been in residential treatment for 6 months, and her letter was different from the previous one. Where the first had been brief and informational, this one was longer, more detailed, more vulnerable. "Mom," she wrote, "I've been working with a counselor here who specializes in family dynamics and addiction. She's been helping me understand how my behavior affected not just me, but everyone who loved me. I'm starting to see how I used your love as a weapon against you, how I manipulated your maternal instincts to get what I wanted without ever considering what it cost you." The letter went on to describe the work she was doing, the insights she was gaining, the slow and painful process of learning to take responsibility for her choices without making excuses or blaming circumstances. But what struck me most was a paragraph near the end. "I know that I don't have any right to ask for your forgiveness or to expect that we can have a relationship again. I know that I destroyed something precious when I stole Dad's ring, something that might never be able to be repaired. But I want you to know that I'm not working on my recovery so that I can get back into your life. I'm working on it because I finally understand that I owe it to myself and to Dad's memory and to the little girl I used to be before addiction took over my life." Reading those words, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began. I felt hope. Not hope that things would go back to the way they used to be, but hope that something new and healthier might be possible between us. Hope that my children might actually be learning to save themselves instead of expecting me to do it for them. But even as I felt that hope growing, I also felt fear. Fear that I might be misinterpreting the signs, that I might be seeing what I wanted to see rather than what was really there. Fear that if I allowed myself to believe in their recovery, I might fall back into old patterns of enabling and accommodation that would ultimately hurt all of us. It was Dr. Chen who helped me understand that both the hope and the fear were appropriate responses to the situation. "Recovery is a long process," she reminded me. "There will be setbacks and challenges and moments when you question whether the changes are real. Your job isn't to have perfect faith in their recovery. Your job is to maintain your own boundaries while remaining open to the possibility of a different kind of relationship if and when they're ready for it." As summer approached, I found myself settling into a rhythm of life that felt more peaceful than anything I'd experienced in years. My days were my own, filled with activities I chose rather than crises I had to manage. I had deepened my friendships with the women from my grief support group. I had started volunteering at a local literacy program, helping adults learn to read. I had even begun dating, something I'd never imagined I would do after Harold's death. His name was Robert, and he was a widower I'd met through the community center. He was nothing like Harold, which felt right somehow. Harold would always be the love of my life, the standard against which all other relationships would be measured. But Robert was kind and thoughtful and interested in building something new rather than trying to recreate something from the past. It was while I was having dinner with Robert at a quiet restaurant downtown that I saw Sarah. She was sitting at a table across the room with a woman I didn't recognize, and for a moment, our eyes met across the space between us. She looked healthy, her face fuller than it had been in years, her eyes clear and bright. She smiled at me, a small, uncertain smile that acknowledged our shared history without demanding anything from me. I smiled back, and we both returned to our respective conversations. It was a moment of recognition, of mutual respect for the boundaries we had established, of hope for what might be possible in the future. When Robert asked if I was okay, I realized I was better than okay. I was exactly where I needed to be, living my own life while remaining open to whatever evolution our family relationships might undergo. After dinner, as Robert walked me to my car, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been when this story began. That woman had defined herself entirely through her relationships to other people, had sacrificed her own identity and well-being to maintain the illusion of family harmony. She had confused love with enabling, had thought that absorbing other people's consequences was the same as helping them. The woman I was becoming understood that real love sometimes requires difficult choices, that healthy relationships need boundaries, that you can't save someone who isn't ready to save themselves. She understood that being a good mother didn't mean being endlessly available for exploitation, that supporting your children meant teaching them to support themselves. But most importantly, she understood that her worth wasn't determined by her ability to fix other people's problems or manage their emotions. She was valuable simply because she existed, simply because she was Linda Richards, a woman with her own dreams and needs and desires that mattered as much as anyone else's. As I drove home through the quiet streets of the neighborhood where I'd lived for over 40 years, I thought about the wooden box Marcus had given me, now sitting on my dresser holding Harold's ring. I thought about Sarah's letters, evidence of growth and self-reflection that might or might not lead to lasting change. I thought about the boundaries I had learned to establish and maintain, even when doing so felt cruel and unnatural. Most of all, I thought about the future, which for the first time in years felt full of possibility rather than dread. I didn't know what kind of relationships might eventually be possible with my children. I didn't know whether their recovery would last, or whether they would find their way back to the people they had been before addiction consumed their lives. But I knew that whatever happened, I would face it as a whole person with a strong sense of my own worth and boundaries. The house was quiet when I arrived home, but it was a peaceful quiet rather than a lonely one. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Harold's chair, looking out at the garden where new growth was flourishing in the spaces where I had cleared away the invasive plants. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and I would meet it as the woman I had become rather than the woman I used to be. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the familiar objects of my familiar life, I had no idea that everything I thought I knew about this situation was about to be turned upside down. I had no idea that the story I thought I was living was actually a completely different story altogether. One that would challenge everything I believed about justice and forgiveness and the true meaning of love. The phone call came on a Tuesday, morning in late September, just as I was finishing my breakfast and preparing to leave for my volunteer shift at the literacy center. The number on the caller ID was unfamiliar, but something compelled me to answer rather than let it go to voicemail. Mrs. Richards, this is Dr. Amanda Foster from Riverside Recovery Center. I'm calling about your children, Marcus and Sarah. My blood turned to ice water. In the months since I'd seen Marcus in my garden and received Sarah's letters, I had allowed myself to believe that maybe, finally, they were on a path toward genuine recovery. The fear that had lived in my chest for so many years, the fear of the phone call that would tell me one of my children was dead, came rushing back with devastating force. "What's happened?" I managed to ask. "Oh, I'm sorry," Dr. Foster said quickly. "They're both fine. Physically fine, I mean. I'm calling because there's something they want to tell you, something they've been working toward for the past several months. They'd like you to come to the center this afternoon if you're available." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by suspicion. This felt like the setup for another manipulation, another attempt to draw me back into their chaos. I had learned to be wary of unexpected phone calls and urgent requests for meetings. "What is this about?" I asked. "I think it would be better if they explained it to you in person," Dr. Foster said gently. "But I can tell you that this is part of their treatment program, and it's something that's taken tremendous courage for them to arrange. Would 2 o'clock work for you?" Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. Something in Dr. Foster's voice suggested that this wasn't a crisis or emergency, but rather something planned and deliberate. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't quite identify. The Riverside Recovery Center was located in a converted mansion on the outskirts of town, surrounded by mature trees and carefully tended gardens. It looked more like a retreat center than a medical facility, which I supposed was intentional. As I walked up the brick pathway to the main entrance, I tried to prepare myself for whatever was waiting inside. Dr. Foster met me in the lobby, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She shook my hand warmly and led me down a hallway lined with artwork that I realized had been created by the patients in the program. "Before we go in," she said, stopping outside a door marked Conference Room B, "I want you to know that what you're about to hear may be difficult to process. Your children have been working with our family therapy team for months, and they've uncovered some things that they feel you need to know." She opened the door, and I stepped into a comfortable room with a large conference table surrounded by chairs. Marcus and Sarah were already there, sitting side by side, and they both stood when I entered. They looked better than I'd seen them in years, healthy and clear-eyed and present in a way that had become foreign to me. But there was something else in their faces, something that looked like guilt and determination mixed together. Sarah's eyes were already red, as if she'd been crying, and Marcus was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for coming." I took a seat across from them, Dr. Foster settling beside me, and waited for whatever revelation was coming. I had thought I was prepared for anything after everything we'd been through, but I was about to discover just how wrong I was. Marcus spoke first, his voice steady but strained. "Mom, we asked you here because we need to tell you the truth about something. About everything, really. And we need to tell you before we lose our courage." "The truth about what?" I asked. Sarah looked at Marcus, and he nodded encouragingly before she continued. "The truth about Dad's ring. About why we took it. About what we've been doing for the past year." I felt my chest tighten. I thought we had moved past this, that they had acknowledged their theft and were working on their recovery. What more could there be to say about something that had already been resolved? "Mom," Marcus said, leaning forward, "we didn't steal Dad's ring to buy drugs." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "We took it," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face now. "Because we were trying to protect you. Because we were terrified of what would happen to you if you found out the truth about what was really going on." I stared at them, completely confused. "I don't understand what you're saying." Dr. Foster placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Linda, your children have something very difficult to tell you. Something they've been hiding from you for over a year, because they were trying to shield you from pain they thought would destroy you." Marcus took a shaky breath and looked directly into my eyes. "Mom, Dad didn't die from cancer." The room seemed to tilt around me. Harold had fought pancreatic cancer for 8 months before losing the battle. I had been with him through every doctor's appointment, every treatment, every agonizing step of his decline. I had watched him waste away, had held his hand as he took his last breath. What were they saying? "Yes, he did," I said firmly. "I was there. I saw everything. The doctors explained everything to me." "He did have cancer," Sarah said quickly, "but that's not what killed him." "Mom," Marcus said, his voice breaking, "Dad killed himself." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to breathe, impossible to process. I felt like I was falling, like the chair beneath me had disappeared and I was tumbling through space. "That's not true," I said automatically. "That's not possible. I was with him. He died peacefully in his sleep." "No, Mom," Sarah said gently. you were asleep. You'd been awake for 3 days straight taking care of him, and you finally crashed from exhaustion. While you were sleeping, Dad took all the morphine pills he'd been saving up. He left a note. I shook my head violently, refusing to accept what they were telling me. No, that's not what happened. The doctor said his heart just stopped. He said it was peaceful, that he didn't suffer. Dr. Morrison was trying to protect you, Marcus said. Dad had talked to him about his intentions weeks before. Dad made him promise not to tell you unless you specifically asked. He thought you'd been through enough, watching him deteriorate. He didn't want you to carry the burden of knowing he'd chosen to end his own suffering. Dr. Foster handed me a tissue, and I realized I was crying without having felt the tears start. "Where's the note?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age and worn from handling. She slid it across the table to me with trembling hands. "We found it on his nightstand that morning, before you woke up. We read it, and then we made a decision that we thought was right at the time. We hid it from you because we thought learning the truth would break you completely." I stared at the envelope, my name written on it in Harold's familiar handwriting. Just seeing his careful script made fresh tears fall. With shaking hands, I opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "My dearest Linda," it began, "if you're reading this, then my children have decided you're strong enough to know the truth, and I hope they're right. I want you to know that choosing to leave this way wasn't about giving up hope or abandoning you. It was about refusing to let this disease steal any more of our time together, any more of my dignity, any more of your strength." I had to stop reading for a moment, overcome by the sound of Harold's voice in those words, by the careful thought that had gone into every sentence. "I've watched what my illness has done to you, how it's drained the life from your eyes and the joy from your days. I've watched you sacrifice everything to take care of me. And while I'm grateful beyond words, I can't bear to watch you disappear, along with me. I want you to remember me as the man who loved you for 48 years, not as the shadow of that man wasting away in our bedroom." The letter went on to explain his decision, his love for me, his hopes for my life after he was gone. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and absolutely, unmistakably Harold's voice. And it explained so much about the months leading up to his death, the way he'd seemed almost at peace in his final weeks, the way he'd kept talking about me having a life worth living after he was gone. When I finished reading, I looked up at my children through eyes blurred with tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were already destroyed by losing him," Sarah said. "We couldn't imagine adding the knowledge that he'd chosen to leave you. We thought it would be kinder to let you believe he'd died naturally." "But then," Marcus continued, "as the months went by, we realized we'd made a terrible mistake. We'd robbed you of the chance to understand his final act of love, his desire to protect you from prolonged suffering. We'd stolen his last gift to you." I sat there trying to process this information, trying to reconcile the story I'd been living with the reality they were revealing. Everything I thought I knew about Harold's death, about my grief, about the past year and a half of my life, was suddenly cast in a completely different light. "The ring," I said suddenly, understanding beginning to dawn. "You took the ring because we knew you'd never forgive us for hiding the letter," Sarah said. "We knew that when you found out we'd kept Dad's final words from you, you'd hate us forever. We thought if we did something else, something that seemed worse but was actually fixable, you'd focus your anger on that instead." "We staged the whole thing," Marcus admitted. "We took the ring, knowing you'd figure out it was us. We planned to confess, to return it, to let you punish us for theft instead of discovering what we'd really done to you." The enormity of what they were telling me was almost impossible to comprehend. They had stolen Harold's ring not out of desperation for drug money, but as a diversionary tactic to hide an even greater betrayal. They had allowed me to believe they were addicts, had let me go through the agony of setting boundaries and cutting contact, all to avoid telling me the truth about their father's death. "But you are addicts," I said, confusion clouding my thoughts. "The treatment program? The recovery?" "No, Mom," Sarah said gently. "We're not addicts. We've never been addicts. That was all part of the lie we created to explain our erratic behavior, to give you something concrete to blame for the distance that had grown between us." The room was spinning around me. Nothing I believed about the past year was true. My children weren't drug addicts. They hadn't stolen from me out of desperation. They weren't in recovery programs. Everything had been an elaborate deception, designed to protect me from knowledge they thought would destroy me. "The treatment center," I said weakly, "is a family therapy facility," Dr. Foster explained. "Marcus and Sarah have been coming here to work through their guilt and grief over their father's death and their decision to hide the truth from you. When they finally realized that living with this lie was destroying all of you, they decided it was time to tell you everything." I looked at my children, these people I had thought I'd lost to addiction, and saw them clearly for the first time in over a year. They weren't hollow-eyed and desperate. They weren't manipulative or scheming. They were two adults who had made a terrible decision out of love and had been living with the consequences ever since. "All this time," I said, my voice barely audible, "I thought you were destroying yourselves with drugs. I thought I was enabling your addiction. I thought I had to choose between saving you and saving myself." "We know," Marcus said, tears flowing freely now. "We know what we put you through. We know how much pain we caused by making you think we'd become people you didn't recognize. We know how much courage it took for you to set those boundaries, to protect yourself from what you thought we'd become. And we know," Sarah added, "that we've destroyed any chance of your trust. We know that learning the truth now might be even worse than living with the lie. But we couldn't keep pretending anymore. We couldn't let you go on thinking that your children had stolen from you out of addiction when the truth is that we stole from you out of misguided love." I sat there in that conference room, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I thought I understood about my life, and tried to figure out how to feel. Was I angry at them for the deception? Grateful that they weren't actually addicts? Devastated to learn the truth about Harold's death? Relieved to discover that my children were still the people I'd raised them to be? All of those emotions were swirling through me at once, creating a chaos I couldn't navigate. But underneath it all, I felt something else. I felt awe at the complexity of love, at the ways people could hurt each other while trying to protect each other, at the impossible choices parents and children make in the name of caring. "I need time," I said finally. "I need time to process all of this." "Of course," Dr. Foster said. "This is an enormous revelation, and there's no timeline for how you should respond to it." I stood up on unsteady legs, Harold's letter clutched in my hand, and looked at my children. They were watching me with expressions of hope and fear, waiting to see if this truth would bring us together or drive us apart forever. "Thank you," I said, surprising myself. "Thank you for finally telling me." Over the following weeks, I read Harold's letter dozens of times, memorizing every word, every curve of his handwriting. I cried for the husband I'd lost all over again, but this time I also cried for the gift he'd tried to give me, the final act of love that my children's deception had hidden from me. I was angry at Marcus and Sarah, angrier than I'd ever been in my life. But I was also proud of them for finally finding the courage to tell me the truth, for choosing honesty over the comfortable lie they'd been living. I was devastated to learn that everything I'd believed about the past year was false, but I was also relieved to discover that my children were still the people I'd raised them to be. Most importantly, I began to understand something about the nature of love and sacrifice, and the impossible choices we make for the people we care about. Harold had chosen to end his life to spare me prolonged suffering. My children had chosen to let me believe they were addicts to spare me the knowledge of their father's suicide. I had chosen to set boundaries and cut contact to spare myself continued exploitation. We had all been trying to protect someone we loved, and we had all caused pain in the process. The difference was that now, finally, we were all living in the truth instead of in carefully constructed lies designed to manage each other's emotions. The path forward wasn't clear or easy. My children and I had to rebuild our relationship from the ground up, learning to trust each other again after so much deception. I had to grieve Harold's death all over again, this time with full knowledge of his final choice. We all had to learn to live with the consequences of decisions made out of love, but executed with devastating results. But we also had something we'd never had before. We had honesty. We had the full truth of our story, with all its complexity and pain and beauty. We had the opportunity to build something real instead of something based on protection and management, and carefully curated versions of reality. 6 months later, I stood in my garden on a warm spring morning, watching Marcus and Sarah work together to plant new flower beds. They came over every weekend now, not because they needed something from me, but because we were all learning how to be a family again. We were learning how to love each other without deception, how to protect each other without lies, how to be honest about pain instead of trying to manage it away. Harold's ring sat in the wooden box Marcus had made, but now I understood the full weight of what that ring represented. It wasn't just a symbol of my marriage or a connection to my late husband. It was a reminder of the complexity of love, of the ways people hurt each other while trying to help, of the courage it takes to tell the truth, even when the truth is devastating. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that in a strange way, my children had given me an unexpected gift. By forcing me to set boundaries and protect myself from what I thought was their addiction, they had inadvertently taught me to value myself, to understand my own worth, to live as a whole person instead of just as someone's wife or mother. The woman I had become through that process was stronger, more confident, more capable of genuine love, because she was no longer willing to sacrifice herself on the altar of other people's immediate comfort. And that strength, born from believing I was protecting myself from my children's addiction, turned out to be exactly what I needed to process the truth about their deception and Harold's death. As I watched my children work in the garden Harold had designed, I thought about the strange mathematics of love and loss and redemption. We had all made choices that seemed right at the time, but turned out to cause tremendous pain. We had all tried to protect each other and ended up hurting each other instead. But somehow, through all the deception and boundary setting and painful revelations, we had found our way back to something real. Justice, I realized, wasn't about punishment or consequences or making people pay for their mistakes. Justice was about truth, about living in reality instead of in comfortable lies, about having the courage to face difficult emotions instead of managing them away. My children had sold their future for what they thought was justice for me, protecting me from knowledge they thought would destroy me. I had sold their future for what I thought was justice for myself, protecting myself from behavior I thought was destroying me. But real justice turned out to be something different entirely. Real justice was all of us finally living in the truth, with all its complexity and pain and possibility for genuine healing. Real justice was learning that love without honesty isn't love at all, but just another form of manipulation disguised in prettier clothes. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, warming my face and casting long shadows across the garden where new life was taking root in soil that had been carefully tended and cleared of invasive growth. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of children playing, the ordinary music of life continuing its ancient rhythms, despite all the ways we complicate it with our attempts to protect each other from pain. I was 75 years old, a widow, a mother, a woman who had lost everything she thought she knew about her life, and somehow found herself in the process. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain but no longer frightening, filled with the possibility of relationships based on truth instead of protection. love instead of enabling, honest communication instead of careful management of each other's emotions. Harold's final gift to me hadn't been just his letter, though those words would comfort me for the rest of my life. His final gift had been the courage to end his suffering on his own terms, modeling for all of us what it looked like to make difficult choices out of love rather than fear. My children's final gift to me hadn't been just their confession, though their honesty had set us all free. Their final gift had been forcing me to discover my own strength, my own worth, my own capacity for love that didn't require me to disappear in the process. And my final gift to myself was learning that justice isn't about punishment or consequences or making people pay for their choices. Justice is about truth, about living authentically, about having the courage to love people exactly as they are rather than as we need them to be. It's about understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's deception, even when that deception is designed to protect you from pain. The story of Linda Richards and her children's deception around Harold's wedding ring reveals profound truths about the nature of love, protection, and the unintended consequences of our most well-intentioned actions. What began as a tale of theft and addiction transformed into something far more complex. A meditation on how families can destroy each other while trying to save each other, and how truth, however painful, ultimately proves more healing than the most carefully constructed lies. At its core, Linda's journey illustrates the dangerous territory between love and enabling, between protection and deception. For over a year, she lived in what she believed was reality, making decisions based on false information that her children had carefully crafted to shield her from what they perceived as unbearable truth. The irony is devastating in its completeness. While Linda was learning to set boundaries with children she thought were addicts, those same children were sacrificing their relationship with her to protect her from knowledge they believed would destroy her. This dynamic reveals one of the most crucial insights of the entire narrative, that our attempts to manage other people's emotions, no matter how loving our intentions, often rob them of their agency and their right to experience the full spectrum of human feeling. Marcus and Sarah's decision to hide Harold's suicide letter wasn't born from cruelty or selfishness, but from a deep love that manifested as a desire to control their mother's emotional experience. They looked at this woman who had already endured so much watching her husband waste away from cancer, and they made the calculation that learning about his suicide would be the final blow that would shatter her completely. But in making this calculation, they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of grief and resilience. They saw their mother as fragile, as someone who needed to be protected from difficult truths rather than trusted with them. They assumed that their assessment of what she could handle was more accurate than her own capacity for processing pain. In essence, they infantilized her in the name of love, treating her like someone incapable of making informed decisions about her own emotional life. The tragic beauty of Linda's response to what she believed was her children's addiction lies in how it accidentally prepared her for the real revelation. The boundaries she learned to set, the strength she developed in protecting herself from their supposed manipulation, the sense of self-worth she cultivated while believing she was saving herself from their destructive behavior, all of these became the very qualities she needed to process the truth about Harold's death and their deception. This speaks to a profound truth about human resilience. We are often stronger than the people who love us believe us to be. Linda's children saw a woman broken by grief, someone who needed protection from further trauma. But the woman who emerged from their elaborate deception was someone who had learned to value herself, to trust her own judgment, to love without losing herself in the process. The very experience they designed to protect her from pain inadvertently taught her how to survive pain with dignity and tact. The transformation Linda underwent while believing her children were addicts reveals crucial insights about the difference between enabling and supporting, between loving someone and losing yourself in the process of loving them. For years before Harold's death, Linda had defined herself primarily through her relationships to others, as Harold's wife, as Marcus and Sarah's mother, as the woman who held everyone else's life together. When she believed her children had become addicts, she was forced to confront the reality that this approach to love wasn't actually helping anyone. Learning to say no to what she thought were her children's addiction-driven demands taught Linda that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's a form of enabling that prevents people from learning to save themselves. The woman who discovered the empty jewelry box was someone who had confused kindness with weakness, support with sacrifice, love with the willingness to absorb infinite amounts of chaos and manipulation. The woman who emerged from setting boundaries with her supposedly addicted children understood that real love sometimes requires allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices. This distinction proves crucial when the truth is finally revealed. If Linda had still been the woman who defined herself entirely through her ability to manage other people's emotions, learning about Harold's suicide and her children's year-long deception might indeed have shattered her. But the woman who had learned to value her own needs, to trust her own judgment, to love herself enough to protect herself from exploitation, was equipped to process even devastating truth with grace and wisdom. The revelation scene itself illuminates the complex mathematics of family love and the ways good intentions can create cascading consequences that hurt everyone involved. Harold chose suicide not to abandon his family, but to spare them the prolonged agony of watching him deteriorate further. His decision was an act of love, a final gift designed to preserve Linda's memories of their marriage and protect her from suffering he believed served no purpose. Marcus and Sarah's decision to hide the suicide note was also an act of love, an attempt to protect their mother from knowledge they believed would compound her grief beyond what she could bear. Their subsequent decision to stage the ring theft was another misguided act of love, a desperate attempt to give Linda something concrete to be angry about, rather than the abstract devastation of learning that her husband had chosen to leave her. Each of these decisions made sense from the perspective of the person making it. Each was motivated by genuine care and concern for someone else's well-being. Yet the cumulative effect was to create a web of deception that caused far more pain than the truth would have. This illustrates one of the story's most important lessons, that protecting people from difficult truths doesn't actually protect them at all. It simply delays and often amplifies the inevitable reckoning with reality. The year Linda spent believing her children were addicts was a year stolen from all of them, a year of authentic grief and healing replaced by manufactured crisis and artificial distance. While Linda was learning valuable lessons about boundaries and self-worth, she was also mourning the loss of children who hadn't actually been lost. While Marcus and Sarah were learning to live with the guilt of their deception, they were also watching their mother suffer under a completely false understanding of their behavior and character. This reveals another crucial insight about the nature of family relationships, that the desire to protect each other from pain can become its own form of cruelty. By deciding that Linda couldn't handle the truth about Harold's death, Marcus and Sarah robbed her of the chance to grieve authentically, to understand her husband's final act of love, to make informed decisions about her own healing process. They substituted their judgment for hers, their assessment of her capabilities for her own agency. The story also illuminates the ways that deception, even well-intentioned deception, corrupts the foundation of relationships. For over a year, every interaction between Linda and her children was built on lies. Every conversation was filtered through the false narrative they had constructed. Every gesture of love or concern was tainted by the knowledge that none of them were operating from a place of truth. When the revelation finally comes, it's not just the specific facts that are shocking. It's the recognition that everything Linda thought she knew about her recent past was fundamentally false. The grief she experienced over losing her children, to addiction, the pride she felt in learning to set boundaries, the growth she experienced in discovering her own worth. All of these were real emotions and real growth, but they were built on a foundation of lies. This speaks to the resilience of human growth and the mysterious ways that we can develop strength and wisdom even when we're operating from false premises. Linda's transformation was genuine. even though the circumstances that prompted it were manufactured. The boundaries she learned to set, the self-worth she developed, the clarity she gained about the difference between loving and enabling. These insights remained valid even when the specific situation that taught them to her was revealed to be fiction. Perhaps this is one of the most hopeful aspects of Linda's story, that growth and healing can occur even in the midst of deception, that the human capacity for resilience and adaptation is so strong that we can become better people even when we're responding to false information. The woman Linda became while dealing with her children's supposed addiction was exactly the woman she needed to be to handle the truth about their actual deception. The story's resolution, with its emphasis on rebuilding relationships based on truth rather than protection, offers a model for how families can recover from even devastating betrayals. The path forward for Linda, Marcus, and Sarah isn't about forgiveness in the traditional sense. It's about choosing to build something new rather than trying to repair something that was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Their original family dynamic was built on protection and management of each other's emotions. Linda protected her children from consequences. Harold protected Linda from the full reality of his suffering. Marcus and Sarah protected Linda from the truth about their father's death. This web of protective deception created distance and misunderstanding even when everyone's intentions were loving. The new relationship they're building is based on different principles: honesty, even when it's painful, trust in each other's capacity to handle difficult truths, respect for each person's right to make informed decisions about their own emotional life. This doesn't mean they love each other less than before. It means they love each other more authentically, more completely, with full knowledge of each other's flaws and mistakes and capacity for both great love and terrible judgment. Linda's story also offers profound insights about the nature of justice and consequences. For most of the narrative, she believes she's pursuing justice by setting boundaries with her addicted children, by refusing to enable their destructive behavior, by protecting herself from their exploitation. This pursuit of justice feels necessary and righteous, a mother finally learning to value herself enough to demand better treatment from her children. When the truth is revealed, the nature of justice becomes more complex. How do you pursue justice when the people who hurt you were trying to protect you? How do you hold people accountable for deception when that deception was motivated by love? How do you balance the genuine harm caused by lies with the genuine love that motivated those lies? The answer Linda eventually reaches is that justice isn't about punishment or consequences in the traditional sense. It's about truth, about living authentically, about building relationships based on honest communication, rather than careful management of each other's emotions. The justice she ultimately seeks isn't revenge against her children for their deception, but rather the establishment of a family dynamic where such deception becomes impossible because everyone is committed to honesty, even when it's difficult. This understanding of justice as truth rather than punishment offers a more nuanced and ultimately more healing approach to family conflicts. Instead of focusing on who was wrong and what consequences they should face, Linda's family learns to focus on how they can build something better going forward, how they can love each other without losing themselves in the process, how they can protect each other without resorting to deception. The broader implications of Linda's story extend far beyond her particular family situation. In a culture that often confuses kindness with the willingness to absorb other people's chaos, that mistakes enabling for love and protection for respect, Linda's journey offers a different model for how to care for the people we love without losing ourselves in the process. Her story suggests that the most loving thing we can do for someone is to trust them with the truth, even when that truth is painful. It suggests that protecting people from the consequences of their choices or from difficult realities doesn't actually help them. It robs them of the opportunity to develop resilience and wisdom through experience. It suggests that healthy relationships require boundaries, that love without limits isn't sustainable, that caring for someone doesn't mean sacrificing your own well-being on the altar of their immediate comfort. These lessons have particular Relevance for anyone dealing with family members who struggle with addiction, mental illness, or other challenges that create ongoing crisis and drama. Linda's initial response to what she believed was her children's addiction, the boundary setting, the refusal to enable, the focus on self-preservation, offers a model for how to love someone without being consumed by their problems. But the story's ultimate revelation also offers important cautions about making assumptions about other people's motivations and capabilities. Linda's children weren't actually addicts manipulating her for drug money. They were grieving adults trying to protect their mother from knowledge they believed would destroy her. This suggests the importance of seeking truth and understanding rather than simply reacting to surface behaviors. Perhaps most importantly, Linda's story illustrates the possibility of redemption and healing even after devastating betrayals. The relationship she rebuilds with her children isn't the same as the one they had before. It's better, more honest, more resilient, because it's built on truth rather than protection. This offers hope for anyone dealing with family conflicts that seem irreparable, suggesting that sometimes the most painful revelations can become the foundation for something stronger and more authentic than what came before. The wedding ring itself, which began as the symbol of everything Linda had lost, ultimately becomes a symbol of everything she's gained. It represents not just her marriage to Harold, but her journey toward self-knowledge and authentic love. It represents not just what was stolen from her, but what she was able to reclaim about herself in the process of dealing with that theft. It represents not just the past she shared with Harold, but the future she's building with her children based on truth rather than deception. In the end, Linda's story suggests that love is not about protecting people from pain. It's about trusting them to handle pain with dignity and grace. It's not about managing other people's emotions. It's about creating space for honest feeling and authentic response. It's not about avoiding difficult truths. It's about having the courage to live in reality even when reality is complicated and painful. These insights offer a different vision of what family love can look like, not a system of mutual protection and emotional management, but a network of authentic individuals who choose to support each other while maintaining their own integrity and boundaries. This kind of love is harder in some ways because it requires more honesty and courage, but it's also more sustainable because it's built on truth rather than carefully constructed illusions. Linda Richards began her story as a woman who had lost everything: her husband, her children's respect, her most precious possession, her understanding of her own family. She ends her story as a woman who has gained something invaluable: the knowledge of her own strength, the experience of authentic love, and the wisdom that comes from learning to live in truth rather than in comfortable lies. Her journey suggests that sometimes we have to lose everything we think we know about our lives in order to discover what's actually real and worth keeping. Sometimes the most devastating revelations become the foundation for the most authentic healing. Sometimes justice looks less like punishment and more like the courage to build something better on the ruins of what came before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.